Hi, this is Digital Beersborn. I hope you're ready to get wet and wild with a little more Indigenous American art. We're going to continue to focus on South America, looking pretty much exclusively at Peru. And for this video, we're going to take a look at the city of Cusco. Now, for the city of Cusco, we have a couple images on our image sheet. We have this photo of a temple, this shot of some stonework walls, a map of the city, and this sculpture of corn. Now let's start by talking about the context. Now, the city of Cusco was built by the Incan Empire, and the Incan Empire stretched across the west coast of South America from the 15th century to almost the end of the 16th century when they were conquered by the Spanish. Now, a big portion of the Incan Empire stretches across the Andes Mountains, and that's where we're focusing today. In the Andes Mountains, we have the city of Cusco. There still is a city of Cusco. This is what it looks like today. It's a modern city up in the mountains, built over the top of the ruins of the old city of Cusco, which is what we're focusing on. Now, the function of Cusco is as the capital city of the Incan Empire. So it's a really important location that had both religious and political sites, as well as some fortifications to protect it. Now, the content of this city, the floor plan itself, the map of the city is interesting. It's split into quadrants. There's 4 different areas that were supposed to be areas that kind of mimicked the Incan Empire as a whole. The idea being that people from different parts of the empire would move to live in the capital city of Cusco. And where you lived was based on where you came from. So your quadrant was kind of a representation of the overall area of the larger empire that you moved from. So the city itself became kind of a miniature version of the larger Incan Empire. Now, on top of that, they shaped the city specifically so that it would be in the shape of an animal, a puma. Now, it might be a little hard to imagine that this is the shape of a puma. If you look up here, this is intended to be the head of the puma. This is the body, and then this is the tail stretching down to the southeast. Now, if we rotate a little bit and maybe compare to this photo of a puma's head, you can kind of get a sense of the head and neck and shoulders of the animal. In the puma's head is where the most important architectural sites are located. This is an area that's known as the Sacsayhuamán, the head of the puma. It is surrounded by this massive wall, a huge fortress, giant fortifications to protect this part of the city. And the stones that are built around the Sacsayhuamán are massive. A lot of these stones are 70 tons or more, massive pieces of rock that were dragged from miles away to build this structure. You can kind of get a sense of the scale of the stones by looking at these people standing in front of the walls. And what's interesting about the architecture is that the stones have been cut specifically to fit with each other. You know, they're not a consistent rectangular shape, but instead each stone is cut almost like a puzzle piece to fit within its neighboring stones. You can see in this one, look at all the different planes, all the different lines that have been cut to make it fit within its neighboring stones. This is what's known as ashlar masonry. Ashlar masonry is architecture using stones carefully cut to fit exactly together without the use of concrete. The idea being that because the stones fit together so exactly, there is no need to use concrete because they're joined together like a puzzle. Now, concrete was not used by the Incan Empire, so they didn't have access to that material for the most part, so this was an alternative way of making a stable stone structure. Now, in the Sacsayhuamán, in the head of the puma, is where we find this site. This is the Korikancha, also known as the Golden House. And the Korikancha is an important temple to the Incan people that was dedicated to Inti, the sun god. Now, as we see it today, this is not really the kind of architecture we would expect from a 15th century indigenous American Incan population. A lot of the building that we see here looks very European. Look at the dome over here on the left. Look at the columns over here on the right. The reason for that is because most of this building is not the original temple. The original temple is really only this darker part. This is the ruins of the original Korikancha. For the most part, the rest of it has been covered up by architecture later, specifically Spanish architecture. Spanish, Spain, the European power. We talked about this. If you guys remember the chapter when we talked about the viceroyalties of New Spain, when we took a look at like the angel with the arquebus, for example, a lot of the work in that chapter were mixtures of indigenous American work with Spanish artists or Spanish influence. If you remember, the Spaniards came over and conquered large portions of the Americas. And that's what happened here. When Spain came and conquered the Incan, they built over the top of the Korikancha with a Catholic Spanish church. What we see is no longer really the Korikancha today. Instead, it is Santo Domingo. It's a Catholic church. But we're going to focus on what the Korikancha used to be rather than the Spanish architecture that we see here. What we know from the records of the Spanish conquistadors that conquered this part of the world is that the Korikancha was covered in gold. The reason why it's called the Golden House is because the entire temple had golden sculpture covering it. There was a garden outside that had golden plants growing from the ground. The idea being that Inti, the sun god, the material that he favored was gold. It was like a lustrous, bright yellow material that made sense for the sun god. So they dedicated the temple to the use of gold as a form of worship to Inti. Now, there's not much of that golden sculpture left. We have only a couple examples. This is a little golden llama that was taken from the Korikancha. Here's a small golden human figure. And then we have this, the Incan maize cobs. This was originally found in the Korikancha's garden, the golden garden of Inti's temple. And according to Spanish records, this entire garden was just golden plants that were planted in the ground to make them look like they were growing. You can see that this is a pretty representational depiction of a maize cob. If we think about our spectrum of abstraction versus representation, this is very representational. Oh, maize means corn, by the way. So Incan maize cobs means Incan corn cobs. Now, taking a closer look at this sculpture, what we see here is silver. The corn cob itself is made out of silver. The husk and the stem around the corn cob are made out of gold. And the gold has been, or the metal has been manipulated to give it a very representational look, down to these small kernels, the individual kernels that are on the silver cob itself. Now, the way that the artist shaped this metal is through the process of repoussé. Repoussé is shaping metal sculpture by hammering it from the reverse side. So imagine if you had a sheet of metal, a sheet of silver, for example, that you wanted to shape like this corn cob. You could take it and with a small hammer it from the back to distort the metal, to make dents that force the metal outward on the opposite side to create the shape of each individual little kernel. You then bend the metal into the rough shape of the corn cob and you have a representational depiction of corn. The gold that's shaped around it has been hammered to give it the look of a corn husk. And then they're growing off of the stem that would have been planted in the garden of the Korikancha. So the city of Cusco is the capital city of the Incan Empire, shaped like a puma. And in the puma's head, in the Sacsayhuamán, is a very important religious site, the Korikancha, the Golden House.